you so much. Very happy to be here. And before I start, I just want to thank Africa Arena, Christophe, Nathanael, Dan, and all the team for putting this event together and having me with you. So I was asked to talk about the challenges and perspectives of deep tech ecosystems in Africa. And before I do that, I just want to tell you just shortly, very briefly about me. So I'm a researcher / consultant who just achieved a 1.5 year exploration of 13 ecosystems in Africa. My objective through Sendemo was to lead ground investigations and to try to talk with all the stakeholders that are involved in the ecosystem, try to understand the different mechanisms that we can put in place to accelerate or foster that innovation or startup ecosystems, and another focus that were much more specific on the business models for startup support organizations as well. And so the first phase of Sendemo that was about data collection and insight gathering is now achieved. And I'm starting the second phase of this project, which is to disseminate this knowledge and make it impactful and try to distribute it to decision makers. And that's why I'm very happy to be here and grateful for the opportunity. Yeah, so basically, as I said, I had the chance to talk to a lot of investors, corporates, founders, SSOs, and government institutions. Some of them are here in the room. And I just want to thank everyone for their contribution. So what I'm going to show you today is more some observations and insight that I gathered from these guys. And before I started to talk about the very specific ecosystems in Africa, I felt important to do just a little bit of theory here and to show you this framework that was designed by the MIT. So I had the chance to work a bit with MIT this year and to get acquainted with some of their frameworks. And I think that this one is particularly interesting to understand our topic better, in the sense that this distinction that it allows between innovation capacity and entrepreneurship capacity can be very insightful as well for investors or for ecosystem builders who are looking at assessing or evaluating their own markets or other markets that they are interested in. And basically, the innovation capacity would be the capacity for a place, geography, to be able to bring new to the world ideas, new to the world solutions that are science-based or the result of a specific R&D process. So something that is really new and that really solves real-life problems. Whereas the entrepreneurship capacity will be more like the subset of inputs that would allow or facilitate the forming of enterprises and their growth. And so it's interesting, this distinction is interesting because when you look at the African ecosystems, and especially the large ones, so the ones that attract the most funding, and especially Nigeria, Kenya, or Egypt, for instance, you realize, and when you look at the startups that are managing to raise funds, you realize that these companies are mostly traditional businesses who are digitizing a part of the value chain that is more or less big, or more or less the whole value chain. And these businesses, they manage to raise money because they are in a business environment that is suitable for them to grow, and also because you have in these countries strong entrepreneurship capacity. So that makes them investable. Whereas in smaller ecosystems, this entrepreneurship capacity is much more limited, but in the case of Tunisia, for example, you will see that this country has a tremendous amount of true innovation-driven enterprises. You've seen some of them in the pitches before. I'm thinking of Cumulus, for example. And these companies that are innovation-driven, the thing that is very interesting and that I want you guys to understand is that the solution that they bring is often a solution to the world. And so their market is not limited to the frontiers of Tunisia or to the frontiers of the country where they had been built, but it's a world scale. And that's interesting to understand because when looking at investment opportunities or when looking at assessing different markets, it's interesting to get this distinction and try to focus on the innovation capacity of a small industry or a small market to try to see how interesting it can be from an investment point of view. And a second layer of theory, and then I'm done with that, is the 5 stakeholders model that was also originated by MIT. And what it says basically that through their observations of different innovation ecosystems around the world, and it mostly happened in very structured and mature economies, you have these 5 stakeholders that are absolutely required in order to ignite or foster or accelerate the ecosystems. And they all have very specific roles. Like, for example, the government would be responsible for the IP policies, for the regulatory frameworks, and for setting up all the institutional foundations that will allow the market to thrive. The entrepreneurs will be responsible for actually doing things and becoming as well maybe role models for the next generations. Risk capital is important to fund research and fund ventures. And the corporates are also very important in the sense that they bring in some very specific expertise. They can bring in some real-life applications to drive the research. And also they can be funding partners, but also they can help ventures to access to specific markets. These 5 stakeholders are very important, and especially the university one that I left to the last, especially when you are talking about deep tech ecosystems, universities are critical because they are the first to come in the value chain of building this deep tech ecosystem. Basically, we need human capital to do that. If I can humbly add something to the MIT 5 stakeholders framework and maybe make it more adapted to what I've seen in the African continent, is to add one specific stakeholder, which are the SSOs. They are also referred to as tech hubs. Their impact is tremendous in the continent. Their number is growing every year. And well, the thing is, like, why do I feel it's important to add it on top of the MIT stakeholders framework is because in more structured economies, SSOs are often associated with one of the 5 stakeholders. So they are often associated with universities, with corporates, with VCs, or with government institutions. And that is important because it brings a clear mission to them. It brings a clear thesis, like support thesis. What do I do, for whom, and how? It brings as well some resources and more stability for them to engage in more risky ventures and ventures that take time, like deep tech. In Africa, the problem is that the majority of them is not associated with with one of the 5 stakeholders. They are mostly independent structures. I like to call them ecosystem gap fillers because they often take on one of the roles that are left vacant by the stakeholders that are not here. So they can engage in business education, which is normally provided by universities. They can engage in ecosystem building. Africa Arena is a perfect example of that. So they always have very different activities, and these activities, but also their positioning, evolve along with the development of the ecosystem. So they are here, they are an evolving organisms that adapt to what exists on the ground and fill the gaps. And the problem that it makes is that they have very different, as I said, activities that are not very structured, and as a result, they are often, they have a model that fragilizes the whole model because they have they are always under financial perfusion, and they always have to build quick programs that are adapted to the different needs of their various funding partners. And that creates some instability that makes them unable, unfortunately, in most of the cases, to address deep tech ventures with the time requirement, with the expertise requirement, and the resource requirements that deep tech impose. So as we start to see it and to understand it, deep tech requires human capital. It's very important, and universities, as I said on the slide before, have to play a key role in that, in igniting the dynamic and igniting the ecosystem. And when we look at what's happening in Africa, we can distinguish 2 large groups that imply 2 distinct strategies. The first group of countries are the ones who need to invest heavily in their education system. That takes time. It requires a lot of fund, a lot of efforts, but we are already seeing some initiatives and some local universities that are stepping up I can mention Ames, for example, whose representatives were here yesterday. I don't know if they're here today. Carnegie Mellon University is a bunch of them. In South Africa, you have great university as well, in Tunisia, and there is a dynamic that is going on, and I want to thank, I don't know if people from the MasterCard Foundation are here, but they are doing a tremendous job in funding research institutions and universities and allowing them to build the human capital that is required in these smaller economies. And the second group of countries which already have solid foundations for human capacity building, and this group is perfectly exemplified by Tunisia, where you can see that 15% of the startups that are labeled are focused on deep tech. This group that has the foundation for developing human capital in science and STEM education, what they need is two things. The first one is to bring on more entrepreneurial capacity. And so that means that we need to be able to bring to these scientists the entrepreneur mindset and the entrepreneur skill set that will allow them to translate their innovation into a successful venture and have it grow. And the second aspect that is much needed in these countries is to learn how to retain these talents. So that's something that has been said before in the panel, but the Africa's most valuable resource is constantly being drained away to follow outside opportunities outside, and that's something that we need to try to fight by not only offering to the scientists and this population all the opportunities that they need to remain and to pursue their research, to pursue their postdoc, and to find opportunities not only to do the research, but to do it in the proper conditions that are offered elsewhere. So we really need to think collectively of how we can involve corporations, how we can involve government, how we can involve research centers and universities, and work together and think together in how we can build this proper environment that will help retain the scientists. And the second point, I think, that can be, oh, there is a problem in the presentation, but okay. The second point that can be important as well is to have local champions. So for example, in Tunisia, it's very promising that InstaDeep has managed to scale and partner with a large corporate, because this kind of local champions, while they are here, they manage to nurture a local expertise, and they become the warrant of this expertise, and they bring in more talents. So the end game here is for small economies to aim for a kind of infinite value loop where world-class ideas and world-class science and research will help bring in corporates and will help bring in more universities, which in turn will help bring in more resources, a more suitable environment, and that will bring more talents, and so on and so forth. On another scale, we see that the same phenomenon that is unfortunately happening with the most interesting startups that are flourishing on the continent. The same thing happened in France a few years ago with the best startups that were always leaving to settle in the US, and it's a kind of normal thing. But the difference here is that, for example, if you take Tunisia, that figure hit me when I saw it. Last year, in 2022, Tunisia was the second provider of capital to the region of South in France, behind the US and just before the UK. That was not the case France was not, when France was exporting its startups to the US, it was not in the same economic conditions, and unfortunately we can easily understand that this is some capital that could have been maybe more useful if it remained in Tunisia. Just a quick quote here from a great teacher from Polytechnique in Algiers, who I talked to, who is also the founder of a deep tech company called AI Tech. And so these guys, what he told me is that in his department at National Polytechnique, unfortunately, he has like 85 to 90% of the students or the graduates who leave the country 2 months or 3 months after graduation. within his company, with his deep tech company, AI Tech, he manages to get some interns or to get some key people to work for 6 months, maybe 8 months or 9 months, but that's just the time for them to find better opportunities outside. And of course, this talent is now competing in a globalized labor market, which makes things much complicated for deep tech companies on the continent. And finally, I wanted to talk about a last asset that is much needed as much as the human capital. It's the infrastructure. And what we can see is that across the continent, the critical infrastructure that is needed to support deep tech and to support science-based innovation is unfortunately missing. When we talk about biotechnology, when we talk about computing power, when we talk about space technology and access to infrastructure becomes very, very limited. And that's the basis, I mean, for us to be able to build upon. And one important thing here is not to consider it as only something that needs to be imported or just brought and plugged in. I really believe that we need to take this with a lot of care. And there is one concept that seems very important to me, which is tech diplomacy. We need to learn, and that's what the Asian countries have managed to do brilliantly in the last 20 years. We need to learn how to negotiate with large technology providers and be able to ensure that not only do we transfer the technology, but we also ensure to transfer the know-how and the expertise that comes with it. This is absolutely mandatory, and we absolutely need it. When we see, it's a question, it's also a matter of sovereignty, it's also a matter of independence, and all these ethical questions that surround the use of technology infrastructure are very critical, and I think that they are mostly overlooked by our government so far. When you look at the rigidity that the US has against Huawei or against other Chinese or foreign technology providers to settle in the US, you can understand that it's a very important question. And unfortunately, you can see a lot of statistics that I don't have in mind now, but about how is Africa being connected to the internet or to the 4G, 3G networks. This is very critical infrastructure for the sovereignty and the independence of the countries, and we are just not considering this question at all. So that's very important to have in mind. And yeah, well, I just said that. And as a result of all this, maybe human capital that is not evenly spread across the country, and innovation capacity that is not evenly spread across the continent, some entrepreneurial capacities that are very different with large markets, small markets. All this results, unfortunately, in a lack of innovation-driven enterprises in the continent. But I want to finish on a positive note because we still see it. We still see it, and as long as we see very innovative startups as the ones who came today to pitch, as Cumulus Water or the hydrogen company, it's the evidence and the proof that the continent has the talent and the capacity to continue to build that. And I mean, this discussion was for me, impossible to think of having this discussion just 5 years ago, and now we're having it, and just by seeing in the last week, in the last few days, all these brilliant minds representing different stakeholders dedicated to work together and to foster, to answer these challenges that are unfortunately here, but to bring solutions to that, I think is very reassuring. It gives a strong feeling of engagement and commitment, and is very motivating. So I just wanted to finish on this and say thank you once again to Africa Arena for putting together this kind of events. Thank you as well to Open Startup and Brain for the event that happened just 2 days ago, and that was as well dedicated for this. On the last note, I just want to say that this is an extract from a report that I have been working on that I will provide for free to any stakeholder or people in the ecosystem that can be interested in the insight that I have gathered. I just have a small bug with my website right now that I need to fix to be able to publish it. If anyone knows how to code, please come see me after that. But yeah, I just want to say that the report will be given for free, and if you're interested, please don't hesitate to come and see me. I'll be happy to chat. Thank you. If anybody has questions, now can be the time, or later. I don't know if you are in a rush, Wasim.
Are there questions for Mr. Chaoui? This is always a good sign. That means it's clear. Yes.
Thanks for your presentation. Maybe just a little bit more about your trip and research and insights that we'll probably get from the report, but like, what was the most surprising thing? Probably hard to distill, but what was the most surprising thing or ecosystem that you encountered through the 13 countries?
It's always complicated to answer these kind of questions because I have like a ton of things that come to my mind. But I think that the first learning and the most important learning that I had during this trip, and I only visited 13 countries out of 54, is that we tend to talk about, I mean, the narratives are very important, they are critical, and we tend to talk about Africa as a whole, whereas the one learning that I had is that there is no country that exactly looks like the other. There is no single mechanism that you can put in Tunisia and reproduce in North Africa because you consider that the region is one single region that shares a lot of culture, similar culture and stuff like that. It just does not work. And in every country, like, well, maybe one takeaway would be that ecosystems today are very shaped by the history, by the last decades of history that happened in the country. It's all the political and economic choices that have been put together that will shape the role and the level of involvement of each stakeholder in its ecosystem, that will like shape the whole business environment in which the ventures will evolve, and also it will influence a lot some very personal, from a very personal perspective, like how people define success, like what's the true aspirations of people when it comes to work, what's their relationship with time, and I mean all these philosophical conceptions are very, very important to consider because the incentives that you will put in place will never have the same impact depending on all this. So please, we need to have a very granular view of each ecosystem and stop considering subset of country based on the language, based on the culture, or based on any other metric that does not really make sense when it comes to analyzing an ecosystem. If there is no more question, I assume that it was clear enough. And please, again, I will be here today and tomorrow, so don't hesitate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.